Breaking news today. Donald Trump has announced cuts in funding to South Africa on Truth Social. This is what Donald Trump said on Truth Social. Here's what he said. South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. It's a bad situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. A massive human rights violation, at a minimum, is happening for all to see. The United States won't stand for it. We will act. Also, I will be cutting off all future funding to South Africa until a full investigation of this situation has been completed. That's what he said. Dramatic language. Trump uses certain words and he underscores and underlines so very badly in capital letters. Violation in capital letters. He was asked about this by a journalist, and this is what he had to say.
So on Truth Social, you said that you were going to cut aid from South Africa. Will you plan to cut aid across other African nations, and why South Africa?
No, it's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things, and it's horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
So Donald Trump's comments have already had an impact. According to the Financial Times, they've sparked a fall in the value of the rand of 1.9%. And apparently it's trading at close to the 19 rand mark. And it may actually go weaker as a result of this, depending on the dynamics. If you want to know how much the US is funding South Africa or was funding South Africa, it was to the tune of close to 1 billion rands. In 2023, the US had set aside 440 million in assistance to South Africa in 2023. The numbers for 2024 are not available. The Trump administration has paused all foreign assistance for 90 days already, and this has cast a very, very dark cloud over the future of its main international aid agency, which is known as USAID. And the website has currently gone dark, and employees have been placed on leave for trying to resist any efforts to freeze these particular types of funding allocations. So they tried to resist Trump and Elon Musk, and they were put on leave. Trump has actually also spoken quite aggressively previously about BRIC nations, of which South Africa is a member, and he has threatened BRIC nations with 100% tariffs if they should move away from the US dollar as a reserve currency.
You know what a BRICS nation is? You'll figure it out. But, and if the BRICS nations want to do that, that's okay, but we're going to put at least a 100% tariff on the business they do with the United States. You know what the BRICS is, right? You guys know. You know what I'm saying.
So there's a lot of friction that already exists. The South African Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola, has responded, and his response was very diplomatic to the announcement made by Trump. This is what he had to say. We trust that President Trump's advisors will leverage this investigative period to deepen their understanding of South Africa's policies as a constitutional democracy. Such insights will ensure a respectful and informed approach to our democratic commitments. Before we go further, I want to say that America has a version of the South African Expropriation Act. This particular post by Trump is primarily around the Expropriation Act, which President Ramaphosa recently signed into law. So America has a version of the South African Expropriation Act. In the United States, the primary legal framework governing the government's ability to take land is known as eminent domain. Eminent domain, you probably heard about that in movies. You've heard people speak about that in various podcasts. This eminent domain law, the power that it allows the state to have is that it allows the government, the federal government and the state governments, to acquire private property for public use, provided that the original owners receive just compensation. Here are the key aspects of eminent domain. It has a constitutional basis. The authority for eminent domain is rooted in the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which states, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This clause not only establishes the government's right to take property, but also limits that right by mandating fair compensation. What is fair? That is part of the discussion around land that was colonially acquired through apartheid laws. That's another conversation. But America has constitutional provision that allows the state to take land. Number two, there has to be a public use requirement. The property must be taken for a purpose deemed to be for the public good. Common examples include the construction of highways, schools, public utilities. The definition of public use has evolved through various court rulings, allowing for broader interpretations that include economic development projects. There has to be a procedural framework. Each state has its own laws and procedures regarding eminent domain, which must align with the constitutional requirements. Generally, before taking property, governments are required to make a formal offer to purchase it. If an agreement cannot be reached, the government can initiate condemnation proceedings. There has to be just compensation. Courts have interpreted just compensation primarily as the fair market value of the property at the time of taking. This value reflects what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller in an open market transaction. So America has a version of this. So here's some quick thoughts around this announcement by Donald Trump as things stand right now. Number one, the USA has, the US presidency rather, has lots of unilateral power when it comes to international relations. And Donald Trump right now seems poised to take on some nations on the global stage for a variety of reasons. He's taking on Canada. He's taking on Mexico. He took on Colombia when they refused to accept the deportations on military planes. He seems willing to do this. And Congress and the Senate have limited power to limit these types of fights because these types of fights sit a lot more in the executive than they sit within the Senate or the legislature, right, which is Congress. So this is something that everyone has to be cognizant of and delicate around. The announcement, and this is my second point, from Trump shows that South Africa is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. It's almost inevitable that South Africa would show up simply because Elon Musk grew up in South Africa. He understands the South African political situation. His brother also is somebody who is very, I think, aware of the South African dynamics. They don't talk a lot about South Africa in terms of their international discourse, but I do think that there is an attention to South Africa. We heard Elon Musk's dad also showing that there's a lot of political appreciation of the dynamics happening in South Africa from the Musk family broadly, be it the mom, be it Elon, be it his brother, be it his dad. We also know that Elon has been trying to get Starlink into South Africa, that there are people who want Starlink in South Africa. We know that he met with President Ramaphosa last year when Ramaphosa traveled to America. They were speaking about being bros, etc., etc. So it's inevitable that with that proximity that Elon Musk has to Trump, that this issue would show up on Trump's radar at some point, at some level. It was inevitable. But the way that it is now showing up shows that South Africa is in the crosshairs, right? That the Trump administration right now has South Africa on its naughty list. They have bad blood, the Trump administration, towards South Africa. And this is serious, not only because of the US aid funding, but also because of the American Growth and Opportunity Act, Agoa, which we'll talk about a little bit more. The right-wing organizations such as AfriForum have been influencing the narrative of and perspective of conservatives about South Africa. AfriForum's leaders have been traveling to conferences in America to speak at those conservative conferences. They also have been appearing on conservative TV quite frequently. If you look at the One America News Network, which is a big, prominent conservative news network in America, AfriForum has been on those platforms. They've spoken on those platforms. So the negative perception that exists has been influenced by a variety of thinkers and voices around Donald Trump. And I think the investigation may help change those views, but I don't necessarily think that conclusion will shift a lot, because there's also a worldview that Elon Musk has and is pushing on social media that you can see. And it's not necessarily one that embraces ideas of redress, ideas of social justice, ideas of affirmative action. This whole, we are going to cut DEI initiatives and all of that, is one that has, I think, an apolitical understanding of some of the dynamics around why these initiatives are rolled out, and how their rollout in countries such as South Africa may even be significantly different to their rollout in countries such as America. So that's my third point. The fourth thing that I want to say is that the rand is an emerging market currency, and an emerging market currency is very volatile and sensitive. If you think about what has been happening, the Mexican peso and the Canadian dollar fell after Donald Trump announced tariffs on those particular countries. A currency can fall as less traders hold that particular currency in reserve. It's basically supply and demand. If everyone is supplying a currency, that currency loses value on the market because it has more people selling it than holding it. Of course, a government can manage those risks. Local investors can manage those risks. People like Rupert, who have deep pockets, can buy those rands as they get back in, hold those rands locally to make sure that the currency doesn't free fall. But a currency can fall as market sentiments shift, as less people hold it in reserve. And emerging markets are more sensitive to these fluctuations than currencies which are established, such as the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar is the fifth largest reserve currency in the world. Fifth. The South African rand is not. So these type of announcements have a real risk to cost of living. And cost of living is very high in South Africa already. Yesterday's Sunday Times was reporting on how food inflation was higher than general inflation. Now, import costs can affect food costs and good costs in general. And when you have a weaker rand, you can have high inflationary pressure on a currency, and that can affect standard of living and quality of life on the ground for people. And that's a big concern, right? So there are some political and ideological fights here in the Elon Musk versus the government of South Africa, or Donald Trump versus the government of South Africa discourse. But I think I want to point out that these ideological fights, while people can stand on one side of a principle and believe that their principle is correct, they can hurt the people on the ground and long-term be very unproductive for weaker and smaller nations. I'm going to give you an example that is food for thought. In the early 2000s, Zimbabwe seized land from farmers without compensation. And part of that land seizure was very violent, it was disorganized, it was unlawful. Robert Mugabe pushed for it. He would make arguments that were politically popular in the left side of the global political spectrum. Fast forward 24 years later, the government of Emmerson Mnangagwa was paying back those farmers compensation. So the fall of the Zimbabwean economy, the fall of the Zimbabwean currency, the destruction of value in the Zimbabwean economy for 24 years was basically for nothing. The elites got the land, the poor are living in poverty, the highest levels of immigration from in terms of ascending country is Zimbabwe to South Africa, number 2 being Mozambique. So it has actually destabilized the region's economic prospects as well. The point that I'm trying to make is all of that loud rhetoric from Robert Mugabe fundamentally was meaningless at the point at which the Mnangagwa government is paying back those farmers who lost their land, the compensation that was supposed to be paid. So that's something that we have to be aware of and cognizant of, right? Now, going back now to what Trump said, the narrative about land expropriation in South Africa that he has been told is wrong. The narrative about reparations and redress that he has been told is wrong. The narrative about meritocracy, as it's told by the right-wing thinkers and speakers right now, is actually wrong, right? And I'm going to do a special episode looking at why I say some of these things, but I'm going to show you why the land expropriation narrative in and of itself is wrong. But I want to highlight and underscore, before we talk about some of the dynamics of land expropriation, that as we think about Donald Trump, as we think about trade wars, tariffs, all of this stuff, we need to think about the people. The people should be put front and center. And ideological fights and fights around political philosophy, right, can hurt the people on the ground. And it seems as if some people are willing to fight Trump and to be seen on the global stage as, I'm the one fighting Trump. And I don't know if that's necessarily prudent. Look at how Colombia came out. That guy was like, he was roaring. He was breathing fire. I'm going to do this to America. I'm going to do this. This is Colombia. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this other thing. And then in a short space of time, Colombia backtracked and they started accepting the flights. I just don't think there's as much value from getting this hand clap from, Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron and a few other people say, no, you are the guys fighting this guy at this particular point. Why would you step into the ring so early to try to fight Trump, the president of the United States of America? I don't know if it's necessarily of value. I think we need to think about the public and think about the connotations and dynamics of dealing with this man more carefully, which is where I think Ronald Lamola has shown restraint, and maybe Ramaphosa won't speak about it at this particular point. I don't know if they'll go a Rwanda way where they start, calling the army a militia, etc., aggravating the situation. I don't think that's what will happen. But now let's talk about the Land Expropriation Act, because this is what Trump was really trying to direct and speak about. And I think it's important for us to have a conversation briefly about that, right? So here's what you need to know about the Land Expropriation Act, the South African version. Section 25.8 of the Constitution of 1996 permits the state to enact legislation that would facilitate the achievement of land, water, and related reform in order to redress the results of past racial discrimination. What is that past racial discrimination? When white people arrived in Africa, 1652 being the earliest point, they were Africans living in South Africa. If you look at the date of the Mapungubwe Empire, that empire dates back over 1,000 years from where we are right now. There are traces of that empire which go back to 1000 AD. If you look at the Great Zimbabwe Empire, right, the Mutapas, etc., that also traces back 1,000 years. So we have archaeological data and archaeological artifacts which prove that there were Africans living in Southern Africa 1,500 years ago. And that would be a significant amount of time before the first white presence in Africa. So when the British and the Dutch arrived in Africa, a system of laws were implemented, particularly in South Africa, to dispossess black people of land. To go quickly through some of them, you had the Glen Grey Act, you had the Native Land Act, you had the Group Areas Act. All of these dispossessed black people of land and created an unequal property regime where certain people were free to buy and sell land and compete for land, etc., buy and sell for commercial farming land, while black people, who were the majority of the country, were excluded from participating in that, as well as being excluded from voting and also being provided an inferior education. When you get to 1994, there's a need to redress that. And that's why the Constitution of 1996 permits that. So Donald Trump, in his discourse, even Elon Musk or anybody else around land justice, needs to recognize that Africans had their land taken from them. And that land was then kept away from them through a variety of laws. And those laws were unjust. And the land was not empty. The idea that the land was empty, it was just the sun living in the Western Cape, Khoisan in the Western Cape, that is inaccurate, that is ahistorical, and that is actually the rhetorical talking points that were being pushed by the Nationalist Party and people like Verwoerd to try to legitimize what they were doing. No legitimacy whatsoever. So you need to know that the Section 25.8 of the Constitution from the get-go allowed for the state to enact legislation that would facilitate land justice. Now, this act, the Expropriation Act, is a limited way of explaining how that would happen if it does happen. It's very similar to eminent domain. It's a 4-stage process, right? I'm going to explain that 4-stage process just now. But you need to know that the new act gives power to expropriate to the government through the Minister of Public Works and Administration. Section 3 gives powers to the minister to expropriate. And it says the following: subject to the provisions of Chapter 5 of the Act, the minister may expropriate property for a public purpose or in the public interest. The minister may expropriate property on behalf of an organ of state which has been established by or under any law but is not an expropriating authority. So that's how it would work. Then there's a 4-stage process. Stage 1 is an investigation, and this happens under Section 5 of the Act. Stage 2 is a notice of an intention to expropriate. This is explained in Section 7 of the Act. Stage 3, after you get the notice of intention, there's a notice of expropriation, which comes under Section 8 of the Act. Under all of these particular stages, you can actually go to the courts, object, etc., etc. Then stage 4, and remember, it's done for public interest. It's not just done willy-nilly. Stage 4 speaks about compensation, and this is covered by Section 12 of the Act. There is compensation that is provided for, and what the Act says: the amount of compensation must be just and equitable, reflecting an equitable balance between public interest and the interests of those affected, including the owner, the holder of a right, the holder of a mortgagee right, and having regard to all relevant circumstances. So, in many instances, people will be paid market value if ever there's any expropriation. However, the Act also does allow for certain situations where there'll be no compensation. That's not to say that's going to happen in every instance, and that is covered by Section 12.3. And then it says the following: it may be just and equitable for nil compensation to be paid where land is expropriated in the public interest, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including but not limited to the following. These are the only instances where you could have nil compensation. A, where the land is not being used and the owner's main purpose is not to develop the land or use it to generate income, but to benefit from the appreciation of its market value. That's one. Land is not being used. Someone is just saying, I'm holding it just to see how much I'm going to get at the end. Number 1. Number 2, B, where an organ of the state holds that land that it is not using for its core functions and is not reasonably likely to require the land for its future activities. In that regard, and the organ of the state acquired the land for no consideration. So where there's an organ of the state which acquired land for free, got land for free, is not using that land can be expropriated with nil compensation, right? C, notwithstanding registration of ownership in terms of the Deeds Act, where an owner has abandoned the land by failing to exercise control over it, despite being reasonably capable of doing so. Abandoned buildings in the cities of in the central business district of Johannesburg. That's an example of buildings that could then get expropriated because those buildings have been hijacked, taken over. People could have maybe exercised control over them, but they've failed to do so. And there has to be the test, and that's what the court will look at, is whether or not that person was reasonably capable of doing so or not. And then D, where the market value of the land is equivalent to or less than the present value of the direct state investment. So where the state has already spent enough money to cover the market value of the land, they may provide nil compensation. This is very narrow. There are no commercial farms which are going to be seized. There are no residential lands in the suburbs which are going to be seized. It seems as if there's been misinformation around what the Expropriation Act is going to do. In a nutshell, and this is the takeaway, the Land Expropriation Act is very similar to the eminent domain in America. Now, let's talk about Agoa, because Agoa, I think, is a big talking point and we need to be aware of it. Here's what you need to know about Agoa. South Africa is a beneficiary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a United States Trade Act. Last year, 2024, South Africa secured its Agoa benefits for another year, which allow duty-free access to US markets. But Agoa consistently requires review, and it requires US legislator to conduct annual eligibility reviews of beneficiary. For South Africa, retaining its status as a beneficiary is crucial, as Agoa does actually contribute significantly to the South African economy. As a nation, South Africa exports a significant amount to the USA. They are the second largest export destination, second to China. The EU is a big one as a group, but in terms of countries, America is number 2. According to the South African Revenue Reserve Service, SARS, the USA received 7.8% of South African exports in 2022. That's a significant number. 7.8% is not a joke. It sounds small until you consider the scale. Going to one country, losing 7.8% of your exports in terms of destination is something that can put an economy into recession. According to the US Department of Commerce, the value of exports from US to South Africa in 2022 was about $6.5 billion or 130 billion, right? So that's how much the value of exports from US to South Africa was. The value of imports from the US side, imports from South Africa to the USA, was 14.6 billion or 280 billion rands, right? So if you look at that balance of trade, it's a difference of 150 billion rands. The balance of trade between the two countries is demonstrably favorable to South Africa. Qualification for Agoa preferences is based on a set of conditions contained in the Agoa legislation. In order to qualify and remain eligible for Agoa, an Agoa beneficiary country must demonstrate respect for rule of law, human rights, and core labor standards. Another important provision to be aware of is that beneficiary countries should not also seek to undermine US foreign policy interests. That's important. You can lose Agoa if you are deemed to be undermining US foreign policy interests. Agoa includes a statutory requirement for annual reviews to examine the compliance of each participating country with the Act's eligibility criteria. But what you need to also be aware of is that Congress has actually initiated a review of the South African inclusion in Agoa. This happened last year. So there are real risks to Agoa eligibility for South Africa because of the relationship South Africa has with Russia and Iran. The Brics reserve currency issue is also something which could be deemed to be contrary to American foreign policy interests. In conclusion, I think what I want to point out is that politicians love to grandstand and be populist in moments where a fight breaks out. They will focus on ideology and principle and use that sometimes as a shield from scrutiny around the pragmatics and the economic dynamics of their actions. But I think we need to be careful about that. We need to remember that the people are the ones who suffer when the economy takes a hit. I hope sincerely that this whole South Africa versus United States of America thing can be handled with the right levels of diplomacy and not the bombast approach that we saw coming out of Colombia and are seeing even coming out of Canada. I don't think that South Africa can afford to go head to head with the American administration. And I think everyone needs to be very careful about this because it can have dire consequences on the rand. It can have dire consequences on the economy, dire consequences on cost of living. And by the way, having learned from what happened in Zimbabwe can end up being for nothing when the particular leader ends up reversing the whole fight and, just agreeing because they're not in a position to keep fighting anymore. So it's something that we need to be very aware of, very cognizant of, even though it's very clear that there is some kind of half narrative that Donald Trump has been told, which is inaccurate. But you can imagine the Ben Shapiros are coming to this chat, the Candace Owens, a variety of people. It's going to be very difficult for the real content to come out. Maybe this video will be one of those that challenges what the Ben Shapiros say. But yeah, we're in a very tricky space, and I think it's going to need careful navigation. Till the next one, I hope you enjoyed this episode.